This is Luke Radowski of wearechange.org, and with Donald Trump changing the political landscape as we're seeing it unfold right before our eyes, scaring the establishment, I kind of wanted to bring a bigger perspective into what's happening, and that's why I'm joined by the one and only Larken Rose, leading philosopher, one of the leading thinkers behind anarchy and anarchism, and I really wanted to bring your perspective on Donald Trump because it seems like when he's speaking, sometimes he sounds like a libertarian, and then other times he sounds like Mao Zedong. So it's very confusing and perplexing, but I really wanted your take on Donald Trump and kind of the rise of Donald Trump.
Well, a lot of people might not want to hear this who imagine that he is an outside force and how many times has that happened where a tyrant comes along who pretends I'm not part of the system and I'm an outside force and all this and that and the other thing. He's a statist. He's obviously a statist. He's obviously an authoritarian. He's basically doing what Hitler did, saying the establishment and what we have now is horrible, put me in power and I'll fix it. And what's been particularly annoying is to see a bunch of people who say they believe in freedom falling for the lie that's been used for centuries, and it's the exact same template every single time. And the fact that even some people who call themselves anarchists are going, rah, 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 this is worth going rah, rah, rah about, that they don't recognize the pattern that's happened a zillion times before, it's kind of frustrating. There is nothing in what he says that is in principle about self-ownership and non-aggression. He whines about what we currently have. And if the discussion is how government violence should be used, the answer doesn't matter, you failed. So for people to see, especially pro-freedom people, to see him as some sort of savior is just kind of depressing. Yeah.
It's really interesting to see him kind of galvanize the anti-establishment, the anti-politically correct crowd in this kind of vigor that's letting him overcome the major political parties. What do you think is a credit to why is that happening? Why is he getting such support from people who are not politically friendly? And, why do you think the political establishment is, so afraid of him?
Well, it's a thing that's happened before in ways. Ross Perot is another example of, well, at least he isn't the same cookie cutter politician liar, that doesn't ever say anything. At least he says something. At least he says what he believes in and yada, yada, yada. And people don't bother to pay attention to what he's actually saying. But because he's not one of the politicians as far as they can perceive, then he's seen as an outsider. And they imagine that means he's something different. It just means he's a different flavor of control freak. But it's, that's refreshing for somebody to find somebody who says what he actually thinks. And unfortunately, that it's sometimes that refreshingness makes people ignore what the actual message is. And they're just, well, at least he's anti-establishment. Yeah. And ultimately, he's not. He would just be a different establishment. Yeah. And, it's only happened about a zillion times in history where you have, Che Guevara, people still have Che shirts. And Castro, we're against the evil empire until we are the evil empire. Yep. And Donald Trump would just be the new evil empire. Yeah. And so again, to have people get all gung-ho about that as if the fact that he's a different control freak makes him good. No, it doesn't. It makes him a different control freak.
Exactly. No, definitely well put. And especially when it came to Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, they had a revolution, but it still established the same powers, the same kind of control, even more kind of just pressing down on society, murdering people, putting them in jail, which many people don't know about, especially the people you see walking around with Che Guevara shirts on, don't really know who Che Guevara was and the criminal past he was and just the awful things he did when he did have that power. But when it comes to the changing landscape, do you see it moving towards more freedom? Do you see it moving towards more anarchy, especially with so many people against the system, or do you see it backfiring?
Having been an anarchist for 20 years, I can say there's a massive increase in recent years. The Donald Trump phenomenon doesn't matter. In the long run, it's an absolutely irrelevant glitch, including a bunch of pro-freedom people who are going rah, rah, rah and think he matters. He doesn't matter. What matters is the underlying philosophy of people, and there are way more people understanding the concepts of self-ownership and non-aggression and things like that than there were just a few short years ago. Ultimately, that's what matters. The political process never matters in the long run. The game, who's on the throne, even empires, rising and falling, in the end, what determines it is what the people believe and what the people think. That is changing in the right direction, regardless of the stupid circus that goes on in elections and all that stupidity. In the U.S. and around the world, ultimately that isn't what matters. It's what's between the ears of 8 billion people, and that is going in the right direction.
Many people, take the responsibility off from themselves, and they think just voting once every 4 years will actually make a significant difference. It's kind of like the lazy man ways of trying to change the system, but that actually, as you said, never really accomplishes anything. But when you're talking about Donald Trump kind of fooling people and kind of bringing another establishment and changing it to a different establishment, but still being establishment, what would be kind of the answer to the anti-establishment? What would be the kind of solution? What would help us bring us towards more kind of freedom?
Well, the first solution, like I said, the solution is in people's minds. If people understand freedom, they not only do they stop participating in the system, they stop paying any attention to it. It's sort of like, okay, there's a mafia over there, and occasionally they pester us, but we're not going to get all gung-ho about the next election for Mafia Don. It really doesn't matter. That has nothing to do with the direction humanity has to go in. And the unfortunate phenomenon is that there are so many people, like I like to use the ring of power as an analogy, like I did in my talk here, and there's so many people who, if they get scared enough of something, like, oh, scary immigrants coming in or Muslims or something, they will jump for the ring of power. This guy's going to use government power for good stuff. And it always backfires, and it always turns into authoritarian disaster. But still, there can be the attitude changing underneath that. People, like, they don't have to fix government. They have to learn how to ignore it and function without even paying attention to it, which is completely, like, you'll know the political process we have the political solution when nobody pays any attention to politics, when they just completely ignore it. And ultimately, when enough people believe in freedom, you can literally ignore an empire out of existence. Yeah. Like, if everyone we ignore your laws, we ignore your taxes, we don't care what you think, we don't even pay attention. We don't even know who the president is. None of that matters to our lives. I don't care who the Mafia Don is. I own myself, my neighbor owns himself, and we get along like adult human beings.
Yeah. A lot of people always call for revolution, this huge change. We need to change things in like a snap of a finger. Everything needs to be different right away. Personally, I believe if there ever will be a revolution, we're just going to revolve back to the same place we were before. I think this is going to be more of kind of an evolution of people kind of stepping outside of authority, stepping outside of politics and power, establishing their own lives non-aggressively, and moving away peacefully, non-violently, away from government, which could take a while. Do you believe in that same kind of philosophy? And if so, what do you think the time frame would be of something like that happening?
Well, there's sort of two sides of it. If people think we have to go do something to government, it's because they don't understand the problem. Again, the problem is in people's heads, and the solution is in people's heads. However, in the meantime, sometimes there are situations where you do have to resort to violent defense against government aggressors. But that's different than revolution. That's just, we're not going to let you attack me. But yeah, as long as people believe in government, if you knock over the current regime, they'll build a new one. And, historically speaking, usually they'll build an even worse one than what they had before. But I think there's a massive amount of progress happening of people outgrowing that whole lie, and realizing that that's not, the way out of this is basically to build a society that doesn't care what the rulers are doing, whether you're talking about economically with Bitcoin and trading on the dark web and all that, and however many different ways you can find to live your life in a way that the politicians don't matter and have nothing to do with you. That is the road to freedom. All of the political circus is just a joke. It's just a distraction. But ultimately it doesn't matter, and it's mattering less and less, which is why the system has to get louder and louder about, you have to vote, it's really important, blah, 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 because the last thing they don't care if people go and protest. If they see people out in front of their offices protesting, that means the people are still begging them for permission. The day the politicians are scared is the day they look out and nobody's there, because nobody cares what they think. Nobody's begging for permission, nobody's paying any attention to them. That's the beginning of the end of tyranny.
Yeah. Ultimately, the responsibility is on everyone, not just voting once every 4 years, but taking full responsibility for themselves and their actions and educating themselves. Now, my last question is kind of like a bigger question. It's kind of an unfair question, to be honest. Is it possible? And if so, when do you think it could happen?
It's not just possible, it's absolutely inevitable. The lie of statism and authoritarianism is so inherently bogus that eventually there is no way we won't get to a point where everybody understands it, because the truth eventually outlives the lie. At this rate, having watched this thing for 20 years and watched the increase recently, I'm not going to guess an exact year, but I think in a matter of decades, the whole world is going to look very different than what it looks like now, and there will be so many people who understand self-ownership that there will be at least large patches of the globe where nobody claims authority and nobody there recognizes an authority. And then the rest of the world will learn by example, here's what humanity is supposed to be. And it may take a long time before it's the whole world, but I think unless we kick the bucket too soon, in our lifetime, we will see large patches of what society is supposed to be. No rulers, no slaves.
Definitely looking forward to that time. Larken, thank you so much. The link to Larken Rose's website will be in the description below. Thank you again so much for your time. Really.